Hello and welcome to the Spotlight. I'm Kavit Afai. Russia says the Pentagon is developing biological weapons in its secret laboratories on Ukrainian territory, and that Washington financially has supported a military biological program in Ukraine involving deadly pathogens such as plague and anthrax. Sounds like a horrible conspiracy theory, but that is not how Russia sees it, leveling those accusations against the U.S. In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at why the U.S. has felt the need for these biolabs in general, and then remind everyone about how the U.S. has used banned chemical weapons against civilian population in the past. Our guest joining us for this edition of the Spotlight, Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute, George Szamuely, joins us from Budapest. And writer, radio host, and journalist Don DeBar joins us from New York. And gentlemen, welcome to the Spotlight. Don DeBar, I'm going to first start with you and ask you this question. Moscow accusing Washington of financially supporting a military biological program in Ukraine involving deadly pathogens like the plague and anthrax. But before your response, let's take a listen to what Vasily Nebenzia, Russia's representative at the UN, has said about this.
We convened the meeting today because as Russia is conducting a special military operation in Ukraine, we discovered a truly shocking fact of emergency cleanup by the Kyiv regime of the traces of a military biological program, which is being implemented by Kyiv with its support by the United States Ministry of Defense. Our Ministry of Defense, Russian Ministry of Defense, now has documents which confirm that on the territory of Ukraine there was a network consisting of at least 30 biological laboratories in which very dangerous biological experiments were being conducted, aimed at strengthening the pathogenic qualities of the plague, anthrax, tularemia, cholera, and other lethal diseases using synthetic biology. This work is being done and funded and supervised by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency of the United States and in the interest of the National Center for Medical Intelligence, a unit of the United States Ministry of Defense.
Okay, so there you had it, Don DeBar. What do you think? The U.S. obviously is dismissing this as, I'm not going to use a bad word, but as nonsense. But Russia says obviously what you just heard.
First, just for a little context, Russia called that meeting of the Security Council for Friday because it's one of the requisite steps in the process of triggering an investigation by the authorities that are provided for under the treaty outlawing those weapons. That's one piece of context. Another, as he mentioned, as Ambassador Nebenzia mentioned, the Defense Department agencies were involved in this research that I think Jen Psaki, one or two other officials, PR officials of the administration, said were civilian, healthcare-oriented facilities. It was not the CDC. It was not the WHO. It was the U.S. military that was in charge of those sites. And so that's significant. Now, he detailed, for example, 30 sites. We have documents, all of this, which are going to be provided to this investigation. The U.S. Ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield, her first reply to this, that lasted 8 minutes or something, she did not make a factual, contest whatsoever, other than a general denial that it was lies, more lies, all of that kind of nonsense, and bad propaganda, fake news, etc. And then when Ambassador Nebenzia focused a little more on both her reply and what some of the U.S. allies on the council had mentioned, providing more detail, she said, "I'm not going to dignify this with a response." Now, she left that room and the press was outside and she held a press conference. This is exactly what she said, her total comment after being accused in front of the world of violating the Biological Weapons Treaty and maintaining 30 bioweapons facilities in Ukraine and causing danger to both Europe and the Ukrainian people they're supposedly there to protect. "I know that you expect me to respond," she said, but we're not going to give any more airtime to the lies that you're hearing today. It's beneath this council, and there's only one aggressor here, and that's Russia. That was her statement. So this followed by one day to conclude testimony under oath in front of a congressional committee by Victoria Nuland, or Victoria Nuland Kagan, as you may prefer, Robert Kagan's ex-spouse or spouse, under oath by a direct question by Senator Marco Rubio. Does the U.S. have biological weapons in Ukraine? She did not say the magic word no. She did not say absolutely not. She said the U.S. has biological facilities there, and she attempted to describe what goes on in there, and they fit the fact pattern of bioweapons, even as she tried to clean it up by characterizing it as something else.
She said, quote, and I'm going to ask you, George Szamuely, about this, Ukraine has biological research facilities, which in fact we are now quite concerned that Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we're working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into their hands. Given Victoria Nuland's statement there and what Don DeBar so greatly summed up for us, what are your thoughts about this discovery that Russia has announced at this time, and the position that the U.S. has on this, in particular, the Pentagon?
Well, I think Don DeBar has summarized it very well. It was very interesting what Victoria Nuland said, because remember, she was asked by Senator Marco Rubio, I think it was something like, does Ukraine have a biological weapons program? I remember that was the exact word. And then she started talking about these labs. It was a very strange response, because she could have indeed said, no, of course not. Why then does she immediately start talking about these labs? Because obviously there has to be some sort of a link in her mind between that and a biological weapons program. And then, of course, she said, well, we're very concerned about it falling into Russia's hands. Now, if indeed this is all perfectly innocent, and here they were doing some research, purely in the interest of science to counter these terrible infectious diseases, why would she would be so concerned with its falling into Russia's hands? What, is she worried about theft of intellectual property? I mean, it was very, very odd. And then, of course, we had the series of denials and convoluted explanations that started pouring out of the U.S. government later that day. And they started then talking about, well, it's about the Soviet-era bioweapons program, and that we're all basically trying to destroy these Soviet-era bioweapons. But the problem there is, well, the Soviet Union came to an end more than 30 years ago. How long does it take to destroy bioweapons? I mean, if all it requires, I would have thought, is to go into some desert somewhere and bury it deep underground. Why is that? That shouldn't have taken 30 years. And apparently, this U.S. activity in Ukraine has greatly expanded, because it seems that there are now 30 of these labs in Ukraine, and then of course there are also of these labs in Georgia. So, again, very, very odd. And then particularly if it is all about these Soviet-era bioweapons, then why again are they so worried about this falling into the hands of Russia? Because presumably Russia would know all about Soviet-era bioweapons. Right. And then, of course, they came up with a lot of innocent explanation. Yeah, it's all about these infectious diseases. The problem is this: there is, even if you take everything at its most innocent, you have to then think, how would the United States feel if they found out that Russia had 30 biological research laboratories in Mexico? How, and particularly as we've just gone through a two years plus of a global pandemic, in which one very, very plausible theory as to the origin of the virus was a leak from a laboratory. So there are an awful lot of questions, and the United States is not coming up with any very plausible answers.
Well, let's just take a step back here, and thank you for that. Obviously, great questions there. But Don DeBar, are we to conclude here, first of all, to come up with a couple conclusions here, that the U.S. in one way or another, whether it's their Defense Department or Pentagon or whatever other entity, were involved with these laboratories? Do you think then that that's the case? A. B. Why would the U.S. be interested in having any type of involvement, whether it's just financing or having more input on this? What uses does this have for the U.S.? Because we're hearing about the plague or anthrax and these toxins that obviously kill lots of people.
Well, George summarized the whole case really very well too, and first it raises. I want to go back just to something I mentioned earlier because it's a very significant aspect. It's one thing for Jen Psaki or Kirby or one of these characters at a press conference to spew whatever comes out of their mouth. It's another thing, quite another thing, to testify in front of Congress under oath on a direct examination, answering a direct question, an unambiguous question, like the one that Senator Rubio asked of Nuland. And what it attaches to isn't just the fear of perjury, and they do fear it. They respect that part of the process because it's a political weapon in their own internal political adversaries' hands if they hand it over. But it doesn't just happen in the context of politics here. You have these weapons, if that's what they are or whatever, these materials that they've admitted that are very nasty and very deadly, if people die as a consequence of that, first of all, their existence is most likely a violation of the treaty, and their existence in a war scenario, which Ukraine has been since 2013, 2014, war crime. Anyone that dies, crimes against humanity. Committing perjury in furtherance of that, you're in front of the Hague, or, depending on the outcome of this war, perhaps some sort of war crimes tribunal being administered by Russia and China. They are very cautious about these things, and you see that the answer is the person under direct questioning under oath answers the way she answered, and the PR people answer the way they answered. And that is very significant.
Okay. Well, George Szamuely, some might say, come on, how could this be? Having the plague or toxins like anthrax or viruses, and the U.S. biolabs. But then when we take a look at a brief history check, which is a simple Google search, you come up with some. One of the ones that stands out in some respects are how U.S. forces were accused of using chemical weapons during their assault on Fallujah. That's back in 2003 in Iraq, in which there was evidence showing that the U.S. dropped massive quantities of white phosphorus during that time in that city, killing insurgents, as they call them, and civilians at the same time, which obviously causes burns and so forth and so on. So U.S. has been involved in using these types of weapons. So then is the conclusion that the U.S. is guilty of being a participant in these laboratories?
Well, that's very interesting because if you recall, after the 9/11 attacks, there was the big sequence, a very mysterious sequence of anthrax attacks, in which suddenly a whole bunch of people, very prominent people in government, received anthrax through the mail. And then eventually this was traced to a U.S. government laboratory. Now, again, we came up, they had an innocent explanation. Yeah, well, there's experiments going on to counteract a particular anthrax attack. So that's all we're really doing. We're just sort of making sure that we have the the antibodies. We have the vaccines against anthrax. That's why we have these laboratories. So that, I think, probably is something of the lines. If you can read, try to figure out what the U.S. is doing, they're essentially figuring that they can stay within the terms of the Biological Weapons Convention by saying, well, what we're really doing is counteracting a possible chemical or biological weapons attack. So that doesn't really violate the Biological Weapons Convention. So in fact, we can go on doing all these dangerous experiments. I mean, it's basically like this gain of function, multiplied by 100. In other words, they're making these pathogens more and more lethal, and the justification for it is that, well, hey, supposing the Russians use these pathogens, we will have the means available to counteract that attack. But the point is that, of course, when you do this, when you create these very dangerous pathogens, then of course you can use them as a weapon yourself. It's not it's not a problem. I mean, you've got the means to deliver these weapons, so you've got them at hand. So the Americans, I think, legalistically saying, well, we're staying within the terms of the convention, because there is a vague formulation that, well, as long as it's kind of defensive, you're not kind of in violation of the convention. But essentially, you are creating dangerous pathogens that can indeed be used as weapons.
Well, I mean, does this argument stand, Don DeBar, for the U.S.? I'm talking that there are facts that indicate that aside from these 30 biological labs, the U.S. supposedly is involved in 336 biological laboratories, which it controls in 30 countries around the world. It's very hard to do a fact check on this because it's just tough. But even if it's just a handful of those, well, 336. I mean, my God, that's a lot. Why does the U.S. feel then, in such a scale, to have laboratories that contain these types of viruses or banned chemical weapons? I mean, George Szamuely said that just to counter the other side, but in over 30 countries around the world?
I guess if you're going to say that this is purely defensive, then you could say, well, a good spread around the globe in terms of distribution, in the event you have to deploy some sort of defensive agent. I guess that's what kind of nonsense we're going to hear. Probably that'd be John Kirby at the Pentagon, in his job to try to sell that. Obviously, we have precedents. After, most likely before, but certainly after September 11, 2001, the U.S. outsourced all kinds of things that are illegal to do here, torture, waterboarding, all kinds of stuff, to dozens of countries around the world. I don't know exactly why they chose to do, say, 6 countries here instead of 1 or 2, whether it has to do with the capacity of each of them to hide it, whether you need a geographic and a cultural mix for whatever, work they're doing on these people. But, there's 3 other words to consider here, by the way, when we're wondering about the U.S.'s record here, and that's Gulf War syndrome, okay? 250,000 American troops out of 697 veterans that were in that Gulf War, they were there for a couple of months, okay? Uncounted numbers of the millions of people in Iraq who were there when whatever happened, and the aftermath, and are still there. Unexplained plague, basically, that killed lots of the 250,000 Americans. Those are the ones we have, a lens on. And we have no idea how many Iraqis. For example, we know in the 90s, attributed to starvation and sanctions, were 400,000 dead Iraqi women and children that Madeleine Albright said was, okay with her. We have no idea how many people died in Iraq of Gulf War syndrome, but Gulf War syndrome exists, and although they blame it on depleted uranium in some quarters. There's been no direct link to that, and it's quite possibly some pathogens involved in this. Sure. So, the U.S., they have a habit of, getting caught with their pants down and saying, well, I'm going to take a shower. There's nothing nefarious here, right. Even though there's a kindergarten next door where they're headed.
Okay.
And this stuff, look at what just happened with COVID and how rapidly that spread around the world.
Indeed.
One of these things that some of these geniuses let loose on humanity, you could be looking at a Charlton Heston moment like Omega Man or something faster than you can say Omega Man.
Well, indeed, and that's the depth of the problem here, and alarm bells should be ringing, because we're looking at what has been reported by Russia, George Szamuely. We're looking at this very alarming revelation, in a sense, and of course the U.S. saying that, they're afraid that Russia is going to use them. Russia could obviously accuse the U.S. and in turn maybe then the Ukrainians' army perhaps of doing the same. But what are the chances, based on how things have transpired with the reports coming out, of these chemical entities being used in this war, one form or another? How do you see the danger of that happening?
Well, I think it's very dangerous because if you remember, in Syria, Barack Obama declared, well, here's our red line. If the government of Bashar al-Assad uses chemical weapons, then the U.S. will intervene militarily. And of course, lo and behold, the moment Obama said that, we suddenly have one chemical attack after another, which means that essentially when the U.S. government says this becomes a signal for people to use chemical or biological weapons as a false flag operation in order to trigger an American intervention. And we know that that has been the strategy of President Zelensky. I mean, he has no hope of winning this war, and he is clearly not winning the war. But the one thing he's got up his sleeve is this hope that the United States and NATO are going to come in on his behalf. Well, so far, the Biden administration said, no, we're not going to do it. However, there's a real question. Suppose there is suddenly a discovery of a biological weapons attack. You have to then wonder whether the Biden administration will stick to its position, no intervention, and might use, because of the hysteria generated by an attack, to get involved militarily. So I think it is very dangerous.
Indeed. Thank you so much. We're fresh out of time. Do apologize for that. Don DeBar, though, writer, radio host, and journalist from New York, spoke to us, gave his insights. Thank you, Don DeBar, and research fellow at Global Policy Institute, George Szamuely, there from Budapest. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, Kavita Goodbye until next time.